Hi, this video is covering chapter 5, week 8 on charismatic renewal in Lamin Sanneh's book, Disciples of All Nations. This chapter is one of the shorter ones, but like I said in my email, I want to go into it in more detail. There's a lot of actually really dense, really rich material here, so I want to make sure you understand it. Follow along with me. The first section is actually divided into 4 questions for our class, and the first question was about pietists and about how natives adopted pietist ideas but used them for what we could call conservative purposes. So, pietism is a European form of Christianity. It especially affects Protestants. And for our purposes, the main point is they sought piety or holiness in their practical daily living. And part of that is that they saw holiness as being something very separate from normal everyday life. They wanted you to be able to do your job, but not confuse what is your job with what is holiness. So, in other words, what it means is that they thought that the world, or a lot of commerce, a lot of finance, a lot of politics and government was unholy, was common, would defile people, so that they had to work hard to maintain a holiness even in their daily lives. And this also meant that they would argue against government interference in Christianity. They saw a very separate, kind of distinct worlds, one for Christ, for Jesus, and then one for the world as it is, with all the underhanded politics, backstabbing, and power plays that go on in businesses to make more money in shady industries and in politics. And what happened was this kind of Christianity is what really inspired a lot of Protestant missionaries. Protestant missionaries were the kind of people who were inclined to seek a very high level of holiness anyway, who weren't happy with normal everyday jobs, right? And just making money, or being, maybe telling little white lies, or to sell products to people. They want to be missionaries. And so this kind of pietistic teaching, even if it's not so dominant necessarily in Europe, is very important to missionaries. And when it gets to the mission field, when it gets into the hands of Asians, Africans, and Latin Americans, it catches on in a very strong way, because natives realize here are Europeans, here are Westerners, or North Americans, here are Americans who are saying things that are critical about government, that are critical about colonial power, that are critical about Western institutions of economics too. All these things that might exploit us, these are other Westerners who are saying these are bad, that these are not really holy, these are not part of the gospel. And so they grab onto this and they turn it to conservative purposes, actually, by which we mean conserving or keeping their home traditions, keeping their native African, Latin American, indigenous, Asian traditions. They say, see, look, these Westerners have come in with their politics, with their economics, and tried to disrupt us, but their own gospel actually is against them. Their own gospel shows that this is not holy. And so we will take the cause of holiness and preserve our own ancestral traditions, preserve our own ancestral languages. And so we have an example of a person in this next section. I have a question about an African teacher called Majola Agbebi, and also how Africans adapted this European version of the gospel. And Agbebi's point was that this kind of European Christianity, or Europeanized Christianity, is very dangerous in Africa, in the way that it's hard for Africans to accept and maintain their dignity. It makes them kind of second class European citizens, people who are trying to become European, but will never be, of course, as European as the Europeans themselves are, right? You can never be as Italian as someone born and raised in Italy. And if you think that Christianity is only becoming Italian, or becoming German, or becoming British, you will always be a second class citizen. And he contrasts this, for instance, with Islam. He says, look, Islam, in the quote in the book, says Islam gives African people dignity. It changes their names, but makes the names the same as the ancient apostles of Islam, the same names that the Muslims themselves have. And it doesn't require them to become less nationalistic. Islam interacts with politics differently, so that you can be a very patriotic Nigerian and Muslim, in a way that at the time, the kind of Christianity that the British were pushing, it was like, God save the Queen, God save the King. So it made you like less of an African, less of a politically an African. And that was something he said was dangerous. And the Africans ended up having a lot of criticisms of the European form of Christianity, which had really stripped away a lot of the miracles, spirits, demons, angels, that kind of stuff that's in the Bible. Europeans didn't know what to do with it, or weren't comfortable with it. A lot of them were not that comfortable with it in this in this kind of post-enlightenment, scientific, bureaucratic world, disenchanted. Some people have used this word, like there's no more magic left in the world. And African religion always had a lot of spiritual forces. And not only that, it had these spiritual forces being used for the here and now, right? Like appeasing spirits to have good harvest, to have healthy children, to have good health, um, uh, and to ward off plagues. So this kind of Christianity actually is there too. You know, there's a lot of Christian prayers in the Hebrew Bible and in the New Testament for cure from diseases, for chasing out demons, for health, prosperity, these kind of things. Um, and so and there's a close attention paid to social relationships. So the kind of watered down what they saw that the Europeans were presenting, the kind of gospel they were presenting, seemed to them to be watered down, and they rejected that and instead wanted a Christianity that continued to bring the spiritual forces to the world, that didn't emphasize just the next life but this life, and that also didn't emphasize so much just believing the right things, but emphasized also in addition um, the way that that personal living relationships matter, relationships between people, relationships between people and God. And so the next question that I covered also in the same section on independency in these next few pages is on the East African revival, and how Africa kind of highlights and also potentially shows solutions to the problem of division in Christianity. So the East African revival basically put African Christians in a difficult spot because it helped to encourage insurgencies, rebellions, revolution, armed uprising against the British government. But a lot of those uprisings were secular, were communist, so against Christianity too. So these African Christians neither wanted to be British nor wanted to be kind of communists, and so they were put in a difficult position and highlighted how difficult it was to exactly say to make Christianity equal to a political proposition. So in some ways, African Christianity is highlighting these kind of new forms of nationalism or transnationalism. For a long time, the most prominent, the most important form of identity that a person has is their nationality. So that you're an American above all. It doesn't matter what religion. You know, when we go to war, you have to be an American. That's what matters most. And a lot of Africans are reaching beyond that, or thinking about Christianity beyond that, beyond national borders, about ties of religion, of brotherhood, sisterhood that go beyond national lines. And in this way, also, they're kind of a problem for unity, because there's so many of them, so many African groups, so much creativity and diversity and dynamism, meaning movement. All these new groups, all these new movements, almost every day, and it seems like splintering. It seems like Christianity is breaking apart, and this is a problem for Christians because almost universally Christians want to see themselves as united, as the same as the ancient church, the same and united with Christians everywhere, some sort of a one body of Christ, that kind of idea. But at the same time, they may point a way forward. This kind of unity, as Sanneh points out, maybe it could never be or was never meant to be in a kind of static frozenness, right? It's not just that everybody behaves and checks the nice little boxes and so they're unified, but more of like a dynamic unity, the way seas, you know, have rolling waves in his example, but it's still one sea, one ocean. So the more dynamism, the more action, the more things are happening, actually, the more there is unity. And this actually tracks or follows some Christian ideas about the Trinity being always in flow. The Trinity is not a static. It's not like Father, Son, Spirit are one because they never move, but because they're constantly moving. Just a kind of concept there. And he is another example of rice paddies. You know, as the rice grows up and it becomes mature, you can't see the different paddies. You can't see the divisions anymore. So there's some hope too, even though there's more, in some ways, more divisions than ever in African Christianity. It may be that African Christianity is the future of unity as well. And then finally, the last part, this last section on independency, you can kind of see that African Christianity, the things that Africans are experiencing, have been seen in Christian history many times, and even from the very beginning. The earliest forms of Christianity, a lot of them emphasize prophecy, emphasize special knowledge and special speaking for God, emphasize dreams, emphasize charismatic gifts, participation in spiritual words and language and tongues, and all these kind of aspects of Christianity that fed the mainstream of Christianity. Maybe they didn't become the mainstream, but they fed it, and they fed their ideas and their kind of energy, and those things became eventually what we know of Christianity today. And the same kind of process may be happening, not just in Africa, but in general, in all these kind of charismatic um, renewal groups, these groups that practice these kind of uh, gifts of the Spirit, that have these fresh revelations of the Spirit. Many of these ideas may not exactly become mainstream, but they may somehow enter the mainstream, may affect what the mainstream does. And one simple example, is Philadelphia, this idea, which Greek word, which means brotherly love, which means love between members of the Christian community as equals. The idea of brothers, it kind of brothers and sisters. If you know Spanish, you know it's the same way that hermanos can be brothers and sisters. The kind of masculine includes male and female. The point is that, though, the main point is that it's a family, and it's based on familial relationships, equal relationships, and reciprocal relationships, giving and taking, exchange, and love, mutuality. So a lot of the Africans felt that what was most lacking, one of the things most lacking from European practice, there's a kind of coldness. There's not that kind of warm, personal relationship, and so they try to rebuild that. And many of these African groups have these words in the names of their movements, and they try to practice them with various charities and ways of communal life to share the things in common, to show their love practically for each other. So, moving on to the next section called Trail, which is where Sanneh really tries to pick up the trail to show how Christianity in Africa is not just modern and is not just something Western, something that looks to America or Europe in the last few years. And because many scholars have thought that. So he's picking up this trail. He's trying to create this trail of evidence. And the first part, he's arguing that many people say, well, African Christianity is a response to colonialism, so that's relatively recent. And it's also a response to prosperity gospel, a very popular form of teaching in America about wealth, that Jesus wants you to be wealthy and prosperous, and to bless you in this age with material blessings. And Asana really points out, actually, if you look carefully, you realize this is not the case. That really it's more the first Great Awakening, which is all the way back in the 1700s. It's not really the high point of African slavery or colonialism, modern colonialism. And then you can see it in actually more African Americans than in white Americans or in white Europeans. You can trace this history, and it goes far before the prosperity gospel was ever invented or thought about. So to give this example, there's a person named Moses Wilkinson, who is converted. He's a black and a blind and lame slave. So he walks with a limp, presumably, if he walks at all. It's not clear. And he's blind. He cannot see, and he participates in the American Revolution and gets freed, and goes to Nova Scotia. Finds himself eventually in Sierra Leone, because the British were freeing black slaves that fought on their side, fought on the British side. So he got his religion in America. He got his religion during the revivals in America. And then he went over to Africa and became a very effective kind of preacher. And he really upset a lot of understandings of effective black preaching. He didn't have a formal education, but he really changed a lot of people's lives. And he really taught a kind of holiness that was very effective, and many people testified that their lives had been affected by him. And he was very resistant to the dominant politics, or completely independent of them in some ways. So it wasn't a reaction to the local white colonials, nor was it because of them that this message was preached. It was from an African American to Africans. And one example of his independence was that the colonial governor came and said, "Look, you're doing great work. Why don't you civilize all the Africans? Just baptize them all." And he wanted to keep the integrity of his message, Wilkinson, and refused to. He said, "Look, if I see holiness, then I baptize. If I see a real change in people's lives, then I will respond." And they had this kind of debate using the scriptures. But it just really shows the independence that people like Wilkinson were able to maintain, and that this trail goes to African American Christianity, and early revivals, 1700 revivals in that century, 18th century, rather than modern colonialism. And then the form of Christianity, again, one reason why this kind of African American Christianity, this is the next question on marginalization and suffering. One reason why this Christianity might be so popular among Africans is because of their common suffering, is because of this slave trade, and their common position at the margins of society. What the message promised is that, if in the political world, and you are poor and you are weak, you just have to kind of suffer or hope for the favor of the powerful. or try your best to somehow gain that power. But in the religious world, in Christianity specifically, the message that they got was specifically that God, the most powerful agent of all, cares deeply about your suffering, is suffering with you. In fact, the whole story of Jesus is that God became a suffering human being to suffer along with human beings, alongside them. And so there's this kind of fair dealing and equality and care for the poor that is common and that dignifies the poverty or the suffering of people. That this is a means of grace. If you suffer, if you have been in this kind of situations, you can earn the grace of God. You can show the grace of God in your life, and this was a powerful and attractive message. And this is also what partly gave rise to a new form. What a famous scholar called W.B. Du Bois, who thought about African Americans, he said that the most original kind of creation of African Americans might be the character of the preacher, the person, the position of a preacher. And this is true for Africa too, not just African Americans. But again, this is a sign. This is part of the trail that shows the line runs through African Americans to Africa rather than through kind of white Christianity. And this preacher is not qualified because of the preacher's education, because of outward skill, because of wealth, because of any formal training necessarily, but because the preacher shows by authenticity, by the fire of the preaching, by their person, and often their own suffering, the way they pass through suffering, that they have a message from God, and that this message can challenge the powers, the political powers, the claims of the powerful and the wealthy. It becomes an independent source of authority. The government has power based on, let's say, money and power and guns and dogs and soldiers, whereas the preacher has a moral power, has a power to speak directly from God and to challenge and to try to threaten to overturn even all of these institutions, and becomes an independent locus. This is very much one reason why someone like Martin Luther King Jr. Was able to channel this kind of black preacher tradition in challenging the status quo. So this so in America, so in Africa. And finally, in this last section on trail, we see that this kind of African independence, this refusal to simply adopt European means or to allow Europeans to authorize, for instance, in the quote here, Methodist marriages to show them what real marriage is according to the Church of England, it kind of lays the path for Christianity in general. We're going to be talking a lot about Africa here, but partly this is because this really lays the groundwork for what we see everywhere, which is Christianity created in the face of institutional power that doesn't just bow to institutional power, but that is fluid, that it moves with people who are in migration, who are sometimes in forced migration, who are in, as we've seen, suffering or marginalized places because of slavery and because of Africa's experience of colonialism. This kind of Christianity is especially powerful when you have the Christianity that can work among these people and among such people. And you look at the modern world, which is more fluid than ever. There's more migrations than ever. There's more movement of people, of goods, of services, of ideas. This kind of Christianity flourishes. It tells people, it talks about this kind of personal interest of God, offers them an alternate source of power when they can't push back seemingly against these forces of economics or politics. They have another form of pushing back, of self-empowerment, of having the spirit that is offers its own moral legitimacy and its own way to critique the overarching scheme. And so part of this, again, one of the last keys, which we've talked about some before, is this translation in African languages. We have these quotes by these great quotes by these Africans who say they, wanted to shout from the mountains basically, or felt as big as an ox when they had the Bible in their own language, because this was a part of that empowerment. This is a part of being able to follow those biblical messages. When the Bible speaks in their own tongues, then they feel like that story of Moses and liberation is their story. Of David defeating Goliath, it's their story. Samuel, Hannah weeping over Samuel and creating a child, being given a child, is their story of faithfulness. Or Mary weeping over her son, suffering. And that speaks in their own language, as I think he says very poetically, the language in which they drink their mother's milk, in which they live and they dance and they make love and they die. That's the language that the Bible now speaks. And so some, to move on to this next section on foresight, some observers, both African and European, saw this ahead of time. They realized, look, if Africa is ever going to advance, we can't treat African language and culture like a speed bump. It can't just be, well, you just happen to be a European born black and you just need to think like a European and you'll be fine. Or we just need to make you learn English, or learn a foreign language, and you'll be okay. It would be like he pointed out, it'd be like trying to unify Italy by making all Italians speak Chinese. It doesn't make sense. It's a totally foreign imposition that really doesn't accord with their national character or culture. You actually have to embrace African culture. You have to embrace African language, and offer them the resources, and speak to them in their language in order to cause a real renewal, and advance. And so the the in this sense, both secular and religious advancement really go hand in hand, because both secular and religious people are trying to push this kind of cause of African advancement. They realize Europe is very far away, very different from African thought. It's not like an Italian learning Spanish. For an African to try to learn a European language is a big jump. But if you give it to them in their own languages, then they can teach their own people. But the problem is a lack of resources. Many of these African languages were not written languages. They never had their own grammars, and formally written grammars. Of course, they had grammars as far as how the language was spoken, but it was never analyzed or written down in the same way that it's expected kind of in modern language learning. And so as the missionaries translated the text into the Bible and gave them grammars, these actually were used for secular purposes, to teach the children science, to teach the children mathematics and other things, and it became, and literature, their own literature, of course, and religious texts, and even non-biblical texts. We have this case of the first prime minister of Nigeria. He's a Muslim, and he teaches grammar to his students in a really innovative way, using the existing hierarchy within their cities as examples of parts of speech, right? So like a noun might be like a king, or you might explain how a dominant clause, is like a king. Anyway, so the point is, he empowered his own people. He reaffirmed their way of life, and he opened the way for a modern way of life, teaching a new grammar, teaching them how to have like a scientific understanding of their own languages, and allowing them to become educated in their own native languages. And this is basically this section on foresight, how these things move together and set the path for the future of Africa, for any hope of African advancement is found partly in these native languages. And so this last section is on assessment, and here we see basically the missionaries turning against the colonizing powers. We see this kind of tense relationship that eventually does happen. And the big example here is a man named Walter Miller, who critiques British colonialism quite harshly. He is a missionary, and he points out, look, the British are enriching themselves. We're enriching our home country, but the wealth is coming from this country where people are totally being impoverished, where they're fighting to gain jobs that don't even pay a living wage. How can this possibly be right? How can it possibly be just? So he writes this provocative book, Have We Failed Nigeria? And that book partly helps set into motion the creation of the first political party, excuse me, in northern Nigeria, which in turn creates the groundwork for Nigerian independence. So really, a lot of this independence in Nigeria is supported by, is even in some ways initiated by a white missionary who sees clearly the problems that these countrymen are causing in Africa. And so the last section of assessment, you can also see how this question of unity, of church unity, really cuts both ways, and how in some ways, despite the fact that in Africa there are so many new groups, so many new forms of Christianity, they are a pattern or a pathbreaker, a way, a pioneer to show possibly Europeans and Westerners how to achieve church unity. Ironically, they form now the majority of Anglicans in the world, and yet they did not break from the Anglican Church when polygamy was criticized. Even though many Africans practiced polygamy, even though it's very hard for them to publicly condemn it, they did, and they refused to break from Anglicanism. Then, when the first African bishop was condemned, even though he himself had made no mistakes, but possibly knew of moral failings of some of his priests, he was condemned and he was deposed. But even his own son was encouraged to leave the Anglican Communion, but refused to do so. And other African churches also, although they were very upset, they complained, but they would refuse to leave Anglicanism because they wanted to have a further conversation. They wanted to remain in the same Christian fellowship, try to work out in their relationships, a resolution to these problems. And Sana just contrasts this, for instance, with the United States, where a gay bishop, openly gay bishop, was consecrated without any consultation with the rest of the church, even in a way, in face of knowing there's going to be opposition. Americans kind of took a unilateral action and broke away from the rest of the Anglican Communion and said, look, nothing's going to stop this except the second coming. So there's this kind of American independence, American shooting from the hip, and other Europeans have also been quick to split churches. In some ways, Africans are much more careful because of their emphasis on families, on thinking about these communions as part of the same family of the church, the family of Christ, that they are careful to try to preserve and maintain these bonds. So we see in this kind of a whole picture of charismatic renewal, from practical care and love in a family situation, spiritual gifts, and the movement, the power of the Spirit in the present age, and even independence, forming and splitting and creating new groups, but also never losing the ideal of unity, and creating messages that really resonate with people as they are in this time. That's the end of this lecture today. Thank you.